Thank you very much, Olaf, for the very nice introduction. And of course, for the invitation to come here. I've had a very interesting time so far, and I'm looking forward to how that's going to pan out over the remaining time as well. So as Olaf mentioned, and as I gather many of you have gleaned from the discussions that we've held over the last few days, those of us from complex systems and A-Life love talking about emergence. Love it. We could talk all day about that if you let us, but hopefully we reined it in a bit in the discussions. I guess I'm no exception to that. So I've put a few of my favourite complex systems displaying emergent structure up on the slide here. Now, I don't always talk about emergence, but when I do, I like to talk about the information processing role of emergent structure. And so that's why I've chosen these particular examples, because they all show something really nice about how we can interpret the role of emergent structure in computation in complex systems. For example, we can look at ants forming foraging trails to compute efficient routes to food sources. We can think about how the ants process information in the way they construct those food trails, those pheromone trails, I should say, and the way that those pheromone trails then affect the individual ant's behaviour. We can talk about, in this diagram here, I'm not sure if you can see, that's meant to be a picture of fireflies synchronising their flashing. So we can talk about the way that the fireflies compute the phases of their flashing in order to achieve a synchronization. We can talk about the way that information flows across the fireflies. We can also talk about the way that we have memory exhibited in the synchronous firing structure that we end up with. We can talk about information processing in flocks or schools of fish, which is a classic example we've seen a lot over the past couple of days. The flock itself is an emergent structure, but also some of the dynamics of the flock we can look at as different kinds of emergent structure. One that I will really like to use, and I'll come back to later in the talk, is looking at cascading waves of change across the flock. The way that if you have a predator come in from one side and the few fish on that side of the school react to the predator and change their direction, that leads to a reaction to the fish near them, and so on and so on. So gradually you get this cascading wave of change which transfers information about the predator from one side of the school to the other. And that's something that's known as the Trafalgar effect, with reference to the Battle of Trafalgar and the way that you can transfer information in that way in a much faster fashion than any individual in the flock could move. Down in the bottom right, I'm showing a cellular automata, which is one of the canonical complex systems which is used to study information processing in complex systems and emergence, and that we're going to focus on in some detail during this talk. So what I want to do is to talk about the information processing characteristics of emergent structure. So I'll spend most of the talk starting out by looking at defining and quantifying information processing in general in complex systems, and then bringing that back to looking at emergent structure to ask, what does this tell us about the information processing role of the emergent structure that we see? And in particular, I'll use cellular automata as a canonical example to study that. Towards the back of the talk, I then want to spend some time on some more speculative questions, looking at how this relates to how we might think about evolution and how that relates to emergent structure and information processing, as well as looking at criticality and cognition as well, depending on how much time we have. So to start, I want to think about how we can quantify or model computational or information processing in complex systems. If you go to a computer scientist and ask what computation is, they're going to talk about Turing machines, which are the primary theoretical abstract model of computation. Turing machines are deterministic state machines that operate on an infinite tape. What you have is the machine has an internal program structure, a set of rules that tell it what to do, and at every time step, it has a head that reads one section of the tape. So at every time step, it will read one section. It will use what it reads on the tape in conjunction with an internal state and what its rules tell it to do to decide how to change its internal state, whether or not to write something to the tape and what to write, and then where to move that head. So it's a system that has very well-defined inputs, well-defined outputs. There's an algorithm in the program or the update rules there, and we have terminating conditions as well. At some point, the machine will read a value, and depending on its current state, maybe decide to terminate and stop. So that's apparently computation. But the big question is, does that tell us about how complex systems compute? Does it tell us how fish transfer information with the Trafalgar effect, for example. And I'm not sure that it's really actually useful for that. Certainly there's things that you can do, but I don't think it answers the questions about information processing in complex systems that we really want to ask. So we need to think a little bit differently. And Melanie Mitchell has a really nice quote. She suggests that for complex systems, if you want to talk about computation or information processing, maybe the language of dynamical systems is more useful than the traditional language at least, of computation. So how might we think about that? A really nice phrase here is intrinsic computation or intrinsic information processing, a phrase that was introduced by Feldman and Jim Crutchfield and company. That's a really nice phrasing. The way I think about that is that we're looking at computation as a process taking place in basically any kind of dynamical system, updating itself through space and time. To put that in a bit more detail, I think we can see information processing occurring whenever a dynamical system is undergoing some dynamical process, starting from an initial state. Here, I've pictured a brain, and I've used different colors to represent different activity levels at different points in the brain at this particular point in time. Now, what happens is that our system is going to undergo a dynamical process, a transient, through time, where these regions interact, they update their states, they take inputs, and through that process, they will have outputs while they're updating their state as well and interacting to compute what the state is at each point through the future. And I think we can think about dynamical processes such as these as processing information in the interaction between all of the individuals in the complex system at every point in space and time as the system updates itself. And that's a very inclusive view of what computational or distributed information processing is. And we can see that in the way that we look at all of these systems that I identified earlier. We can think about each individual fish in the school as making a computation through time by looking at its own behaviour, by taking into account inputs from its neighbours, what their headings are, what their relatives' positions are, and computing what it's going to do at every point as time moves on. And all of the fish in the system are undertaking these kind of computations in parallel, and that generates a collective computation that's taking place in the system. So Melanie then goes and suggests some questions that we could pose to try and make these notions more precise. And what I want to focus on is the third question here. How is information processed during this transient? And in particular, we know it's processed in the interactions between the elements in the system as they update themselves through time. So in order to try and address that question, to try and make this a bit more precise, we can notice that we talk about computation in all these systems qualitatively, using terms such as memory and signaling and processing. And so what we want to do is to try and quantify computation, to quantitatively model it in a similar sort of fashion. So to quantitatively model intrinsic computation in a similar language to the way it's normally qualitatively described. If we can do that quantitatively, talking about how information is stored, how it's transferred, and how it's modified, then that should give us a better understanding of how nature computes and why it's complex, and help to use the intuition that we already have from these systems, but take that and make it a bit more quantitative. And for the purposes of this talk, that will hopefully help us to understand the role of emergent structure in these examples as well. So cellular automata, as I said before, are kind of a classic canonical system that's used to study information processing in complex systems and emergent structures. So we're going to concentrate on those to a large degree in this talk. I'm going to show you here what are called the elementary cellular automata. These are basically almost as simple as you can get with the ECAs. What we have is a one-dimensional array. So the array is a row across the page here, a one-dimensional array of cells which each have binary states, 0 or 1, white or black. Those cells in the cellular automata update themselves synchronously in time. So each row here is a different time slice showing what the activity of each cell is at that different slice in time. The way they update themselves is simply as a function of one neighbour on either side. It's a deterministic rule, and it's the same rule followed by every cell in the CA here. So this is an example of what a rule might look like. What we can do is we can lay out all the 8 possible neighbourhood configurations here, and what the next value is going to be for each one of those configurations. So here, for example, if a central cell was white and the guy on this side was black, the guy on this side was white, he's going to update himself to be black at the next time step. We can write down a rule number based on a decimalization of this binary string here to represent the rule, and that's what we've listed here as rule 54. Now, obviously, we can generate lots of different rule tables, and those different rules are going to generate very different dynamics. So we might have some very boring dynamics like this one here, where very quickly we settle from an initial condition into something that doesn't really interact, or we might have some things that look a bit more random like this one here, or some things that show some more structure, like these classically regarded complex rules, Rule 54 and Rule 110, where we start to see some emergent structure. So here we might talk about these static structures here, which don't move in space but recur across time, which we call blinkers. And now these are, we can call these emergent structure because using some of the language we've looked at in the last couple of days, by having an understanding of what these structures are, that helps us to get an efficient prediction of what we are going to see in the dynamical system later on. I can just tell you that there's a blinker here, and you know with high probability we're going to see that blinker recurring as we go down through time in that same spot. We can see the same thing, we can get the same effect if we look at the background, what we call the domain here. We have a spatiotemporally regular background pattern in these different rules. And again, knowing that that's there gives us predictive power about what's coming in the future in a fairly efficient way. We can also look at structures that propagate against the background domain, which are known as gliders. I'm not sure how well you can see it on the screen there, but there's one coming along here. You can see discontinuity against the background domain. Now, there are some very well-known conjectures about the computational role of these emergent structures that date back to Langton, and many people have talked about these since. So we can understand that these blinker structures, we can sort of interpret them as containing some memory, because knowing that we have that structure here, effectively we can model that as laying down some memory that we can use to predict what's happening at that same point in the system later on. In a similar fashion, this glider structure here is conjectured to be an agent of information transfer. And that makes qualitative sense, because if I tell you that this glider was here and we know how it's moving through space and time, then that helps us to predict later on that glider is going to recur down here. Or from a reverse perspective, if you find the glider down here, that's telling you some information about what the spatiotemporal dynamics look like back here at some other point in the system at an earlier point in time. So those conjectures qualitatively make some sense. They can be a bit hard to pick out here, so let me show you another example that I really like, where it's a bit more clear what the computational role is. So this is the result of an experiment that Melanie Mitchell and Jim Crutchfield and company did some time ago, where they used genetic algorithms to breed cellular automata to solve certain specific computational tasks. This task here is a density classification task. The goal of the GA is to get a cellular automata rule that takes an initial condition and converges to a final homogeneous state, either black or white, based on what the most common state was in the first line in the CA. So that's a task that's very easy to express but very hard to solve in a distributed fashion. It turns out that the kinds of rules that work very well for this and other tasks are ones that have emergent structure, and we can very easily qualitatively interpret the role of those emergent structures in the computation. What we see here is that we have simple background domains being either white or black that kind of reflect local decisions being made about what the majority was. Obviously, they compete in the early dynamics of the CA before settling down to a decision later on. How that decision is reached is through the interaction of emergent structures at the boundaries between these background domains. So, for example, we can see this emergent structure here, and we can understand that to be storing information about a disagreement between what's in the majority. We can see other propagating structures, such as this leading edge of this checkerboard pattern. The checkerboard pattern represents, again, an uncertainty, but it's an uncertainty that's effectively sending out a signal that it kind of needs help to determine what the result is going to be. So when that uncertainty propagates and reaches this one here, you can kind of interpret a decision being made that there was some more certainty about it being black from this side, then there was certainty about it being white here, which was overtaken by another uncertainty. So the net result was a decision that black was a local majority, and so we get a fast propagation of information about that in this glider structure here. We can see those structures very nicely through, this is an epsilon machine view of what's happening there. And we can then, that allows us to see the role of these emergent structures in storing information, in transferring information, and the interactions between them in modifying information. In order to quantitatively model and measure how much information is being stored, how much is being transferred, and so on, we need a framework. We need some measures to quantify these things. We kind of know what we're looking for, but how can we actually measure that? So we use an approach that we call information dynamics, which is asking the question of how the next state of a variable in a complex system is computed. So we're looking here at complex systems that we can view as multivariate time series of states. You can't look at all complex systems in this way, but a very large number of them you can. So you could look at the individuals in a flock here. You could look at variables representing the heading and position of each individual in the flock. You can look at their time series of activity in that way, and then we're going to look at how they're interacting. You could look at neurons in a neural network and whether they're spiking or not at different points in time as a time series of activity there, and then look at how they're interacting and so on. Once we have a system like that that's in scope for us, what we're doing is we're asking about how the information in one specific value in time in one variable, where the information comes from, where that value was computed from. How can we model that computation? How can we model it specifically in terms of how much information that was stored in the past of the variable that was used in the computation of the update there, how much was transferred from other sources, and how can we partition those operations, and so on. Now, don't be frightened by the maths here. I'm not going to go through all this. This slide is really only to show you the measures that are coming shortly are based in information theory. So information theory is the rigorous way to talk about what information is. I'm not going to go through them all here. We obviously don't have time to do that, but if you want to read more about the measures that we're going to use, information theory is the starting point. So what I'll do is I'm not going to show you all the measures that we have under our consideration. I'm just going to show you two of my favourites here. So when we're talking about information storage, again, there's lots of different ways that we can model that. The way that we're going to use here is something called active information storage. We're going to ask in the state update of this variable here, how much information would we model is coming from or being used from the past state of that variable. And we represent the past state by a vector of consecutive values of activity of that variable from the past. So we look at a mutual information between these consecutive variables as a joint vector to the very next value that we're trying to decode or model the computation of. So that's a mutual information there, quantifying, modeling how much information from the past state of that variable is in use in its state update. We can also look at not just an average value. If you're familiar with information theory, we're normally dealing with average values. We can also ask for pointwise or local values. So we can ask about specific configurations. So in this configuration here, how much information was in use from the past, and that might give us this value here. We can ask the same thing one point back in time, which would give us a different value, and so on. So we end up with a time series that tells us how these dynamics of information storage fluctuate through time, and we can relate that to what the system is doing. The classic example of that is in applying it to the cellular automata and looking at the conjectures about information processing and the role of emergent structures that we discussed before. So if we apply it to Rule 54 here, what we see is that what's highlighted in blue here are the strong dominant actions of information storage in the system, and we see that the background domains and the gliders are showing up as strongly storing information, which aligns exactly with what the conjectures were about the role of those particular emergent structures, which is a nice start. Where I think things get much more interesting is when we start talking about the interactions. So this is just looking at single variables in the system. We now want to ask, okay, what about the interactions? What do they add to our model of the information processing here? And for that, we're going to go to a concept of information transfer. We're then going to ask, given that we've already accounted in our model for how much influence the past had. If I then look at a source, say Y1 here, what would I model as being transferred from that source about the computation of this next value in the context of what I've already seen from the past? And that's captured by the transfer entropy. Without going into the maths, what's useful here is that the storage and transfer are complementary measures. They don't overlap. So one thing that we model as storage, we're not going to model again as information transfer. Similarly, we can take local values here, so we can generate time series dynamics of how the information flows fluctuate in the system as a function of space and time. And when we apply that to cellular automata, again, we see that the conjectures about the role of the emergent structures are upheld quantitatively. So here what we see, if we measure information flow from the left to the right at every point in space and time, what we see is the dominant information transfer entities are indeed the gliders that are moving to the left. And when we look at, moving to the right. And when we look at information transfer to the left, we see that the dominant information transfer entities are those that are moving to the left. So that kind of exactly corresponds to the conjectures on the role of emergent structure in computation here, which is really nice. So this information processing perspective captures that emergent structure and its computational role. This contrasts with a directly causal view. If we take an interventionist kind of causal view here, like a Pearl interventionist view of intervening in the system, we don't see the same kind of roles of these emergent structures. If we go and intervene, the results of interventions in the glider are often the same as the results in the background domain. So this kind of model, this perspective of information processing is telling us something different, which is really nice. Okay, so in the last sort of 10 minutes or so, what I want to do is then think about, speculate a little bit on what some of this means. So, we've sort of shown how we can now have some quantitative measures that we can take and look at the computational role of different emergent structures. So what does that tell us? So the first thing I want to do is think about when do we actually find emergent structure performing computational roles that are similar to these? And obviously, the kind of obvious answer to that is when we evolve systems to solve specific problems. The classic example of that being the density classification task that I showed you from Mitchell and company. But we see the same kinds of structures in lots of different biological systems. So we see perturbation waves in protein networks that are conjectured as dominant information carriers. We see waves of stomatal aperture opening and closing in flowers. We see the cascading waves in flocks and schools that I mentioned earlier as implementing this Trafalgar effect. And in that example, we've looked at that using this, as Ola said, sort of putting our information sunglasses on and filtering where the information is flowing. We had an experiment where we could isolate fish in a circular tank. So the only thing they could do were U-turns, which would basically represent cascading waves conjectured to have cascading waves of information going across the school as it made a turn. And indeed, that's exactly what we saw. As the first fish and second fish and third fish turn, they're each transferring information to their peers as they're doing so. So again, it's showing us that we can quantitatively capture the information processing role of these emergent structures. We see the same kinds of things come up when we evolve not just for a specific task, but here we had an experiment where we evolved for information transfer as the fitness function in a snake-like robot where each module in the snake could be controlled independently. We got the same kind of cascading waves, glider-like structures emerging and moving along the snake's body, which is really interesting. So we start to see these emergent structures coming out and fulfilling computational roles, whether we evolve for task or whether we evolve for a computational property itself. So it's quite possible that these coherent wave structures, these glider-like structures, may be some kind of resonant mode in evolution for information flow. These emergent structures, they may be robust and optimal for coherent computation over long distances, and they may be simple to construct via evolutionary steps. That's all conjecture, but I think it's very interesting to think about. Next, I want to touch briefly on criticality in information processing. I want to touch on this because these kind of emergent cascade structures are often associated with critical dynamics. We talk about We talk about scale-free distributions of such cascade structures being associated with critical points when systems are undergoing phase transitions. A classic example there is looking at random Boolean networks as simple models of gene regulatory networks. Now here, you can induce order chaos phase transitions in RBNs with respect to perturbation avalanches as the order parameter, and you can do that with various control parameters, including changing the activity in the network. You could go from very low activity states, which typically have very ordered kind of dynamics, to you can tune that to being very high activity states, which typically have very chaotic dynamics, and you'll have a critical point in the middle where you start to get scale-free structure in the perturbation avalanches here. Kaufman famously suggested that at this critical point, this edge of chaos, he suggested this should be selected for or emerge in GRNs because they balance robustness with fast reaction to system changes via such emergent structures. What we did was to have a look at what these information processing properties do as we vary a control parameter to go from very ordered states on the very ordered kinds of dynamics on the left of the diagram to very chaotic dynamics on the right, with a critical regime somewhere in the middle here. The black line here, I won't go into the detail of what that is, but that's our order parameter showing that this is around where the critical state is. What we get is that we see that the ordered kinds of dynamics are dominated by information storage kinds of dynamics. The more chaotic dynamics are dominated by information transfer kind of dynamics, but we have a nice mix of the two in the middle, which is very interesting. What I haven't shown here is that we've done similar experiments with systems, with neural systems, with both artificial neural networks and real in vitro spiking neural networks, where in both we kind of have access to a control parameter that we can trigger, that we can use to trigger a phase transition in a similar way, and we get very similar results in those as well. So in quite a few systems, what we start to see is that around these critical points that we see a very nice balance between information storage and information transfer. Now, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to find that systems have to be or even drive towards these critical points, but it does suggest there are some computational advantages in doing so, in being very flexible to being able to implement very different kinds of information processing and being able to flexibly switch between them with very small changes. I think Sarah's going to talk a lot more about criticality and some related measures in her talk shortly. I'm not really going to go so much into detail about applications for these measures in neuroscience because we're pretty much out of time. What I do want to say here is that what we have done is taken these same measures of modelling how information is stored and how it's transferred in complex systems data sets, and we've been able to apply them to a whole lot of experiments with brain imaging data. And for me, this is really cool because it hits something that Jim mentioned yesterday, which is, it's all well and good when we can see emergent structure and we know it's there. What about if we have huge data sets? We can't see it. We want measures that we know can still operate and give us something that we know what they're giving us, even though we can't get in there and see that in the system. So I think that's really important that these measures, we know what they're giving us, so we can use them to answer questions about how information is processed in large neural data sets. And we've been able to do a whole pile of things there, including characterizing different kinds of brain dynamics in different conditions. For example, we looked at autism spectrum disorder and saw very different information storage dynamics there compared to controls, for example. But it's probably time we should finish up. So if you're interested in brain dynamics, we can talk more about that later on. But what we've done here is to talk through a set of measures, or at least a subset of a larger set of measures that we are using to model operations on information in complex systems. And in particular, we're doing that on a local scale in space and time, so we can talk about the dynamics of how information processing unfolds. These measures can be used to reveal the computational role of emergent structure, which I think is very important. In the context of this conference, what it's adding is an understanding of what that emergent structure is doing dynamically from an information processing point of view. I kind of gave some short hints about some of the connections here between views of information processing, emergent structure with evolution and criticality and cognition. But there's a lot more. There's a lot more that needs to be explored there. And one very promising direction, I think, is something called information decomposition. It's not something that I've had time to go into here, but there's several of us here who are actively working in this field where we can start to measure new quantities like what we call synergy, which kind of relates to this idea of when the whole is more than the sum of the parts, which may or may not be a way forward. Anyway, let's have some questions.
Thank you so much, Joe. Okay, do we have any question from the audience here? Who wants to go?
So I wanted to actually, given your talk, follow up on a question that was raised yesterday by Mary, I think, and she asked if all emergent phenomena are evolvable, and I think there was an appropriately terrified response from some of the biologists in the room as a very high bar, but I think maybe adaptive is a better word, and that there's this emergent phenomena seem to be balanced in this flexible and yet robust sort of sweet spot. And I wonder if you think that you can use information dynamics to be very explicit about maybe a quantitative definition of adaptive that may be useful in a lot of different systems.
That's a very big question. That's a very big question. Okay, where to start? So on some of the speculation there, are all emergent phenomena evolvable or adaptable? I'm not sure I'd go that far. Certainly, as you said, adaptability is probably a much lower bar. Are all of them adaptable? No, I'm not even sure I'd go that far. Probably most of them that we see having evolved probably are, but I'm not sure that everything that I would call emergent would be. In terms of then how we could use measures from information theory to study adaptability, that's a good question. It's not something that I've looked at or thought about, but it is something that people are doing. So where is Martin? Where is Martin? We were talking about it just the other day. So you're kind of working in a related field like this, right? Do you want to make any comments on adaptability? You don't have to. Just try and open it if you want to. But the point is, people are thinking about it. I'm not sure that there's I'm not sure the question's not settled though, right? That's probably the main thing to say at the moment. But people are thinking about it. I probably don't have anything that novel to say about it myself though.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, we have a question from Stuart.
So thanks for the great talk. I really enjoyed it. This is a great framework for understanding information processing and storage, and especially these critical points where you see this maximization of computation. So in the origin of life, one of the things that interests me most is trying to understand when you have a system that's driven out of equilibrium. You know, a lot of systems will just dissipate energy, go down hills in a sort of boring way. But as we know, other systems on their way to facilitating a dissipation, they'll create all kinds of structure. And so, broadly speaking, what do we need? What are the ingredients in terms of boundary conditions and internal constituents to have systems where you'll observe spontaneous computation? Do you think? What's your opinion on that?
It's a great question, and in fact, that's really where we started with all this, going back a long time ago now, maybe 13 or 14 years ago. This is kind of where we started. So I sat down with my PhD advisor, Mikhail Prokopenko, and he was very much in the A-Life community and was asking the same sorts of questions. You know, what would we want? What sort of information processing capabilities would we want to generate interesting, exploratory, adaptive behavior? We never really got there. I mean, and we kind of just went in a different direction. We kind of got so interested in actually measuring these things and looking at what they showed that we never really came back to the question. But even so, it's something that I've thought about on and off, and I don't have a good answer for. I mean, one thing I would say is that certainly not any one of these capabilities alone is enough. you can look at, for example, cellular automata rule 2 here. There's kind of obviously very strong transfer in one direction here. So we have one strong computational capability, but obviously nothing very interesting is happening. I think probably you're going to need several strong capabilities there. Certainly some kind of bidirectional information transfer, which you're going to start to get in feedback interactions and so on. In terms of actually putting that more formally, I don't have a good way forward on that yet, but I think there's a lot that can be done there.
Thank you.
Oh, can I just pick up one more thing on that before we move on to the next question? So in a similar fashion, I guess that's something that I see as very important about what we showed with the computational properties around criticality, that it's not just one operation on information that's dominating, that you have a nice mix of both storage and transfer from multiple sources, so you can start to do more interesting things in those kinds of dynamics. As I say, I'm not really sure how to make that tangible and take it forward, but that's kind of what I'm thinking about.
Time for one more quick question somewhere.
Oh, sorry.
There's one. Oh, I don't see it.
Oh, what about
there is
that?
none. Okay. Yeah. I have. Okay. Yeah, Martin.
Did I screw this up?
Just a comment maybe. So I think to get to adaptivity from this framework, because this is kind of, there's no life or agent or even entity really here. I mean, it's kind of like maybe these cellular automata, at least I see them more like a kind of toy physics, maybe even microscopic physics. And I think to look at adaptivity in the sense that we understand it usually in biological systems, you first need like an entity or agent or something, and then. But I think also for getting to these concepts, also frameworks like this are probably going to be helpful. But I think we don't really have the final answer yet how to get basically the emergence of an entity in a system like this. That was it.
Okay. I think that was more of a comment, really, wasn't it?
Yes, it was a comment.
Cool.
Let's thank Joe again.